Hello and welcome to this episode of Let's Talk, the podcast which is presented by the South African Medico-Legal Reports. My name is Ian Dutton and I'm the editor of the South African Medico-Legal Reports. And I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Herman EDELING, and he's going to talk to us about certain aspects of quantifying general damages in general terms, and then in particular, obviously, deal with certain aspects relating to head injuries. He has a wealth of information at his disposal and experience. Herman, welcome. I'm really looking forward to listening to you tonight and learning from you and exploring this topic together.
Thank you very much, Ian. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here. And it's always nice to talk to you.
Thank you, Herman. Herman, you know, the topic of general damages is one in any personal injury matter, it's incredibly important. It comes up in most cases. It's very exceptional that you won't have a general damages aspect to a case. But how general damages are approached and the quantification of general damages sometimes leaves a lot to be desired. And we thought it would be useful to take a dive into how one should properly approach the assessment of general damages, whether as an expert witness, whether as a judge, or whether as an advocate. And Herman, I'll just hand over to you to make some preliminary remarks, and then let's deal with some specific issues after that.
With pleasure, Ian. By way of introduction, let me say this. What I would like to say about general damages is from the medical point of view, because to determine fair compensation for general damages, it is important for the judge to understand the medical condition of the injured person. So that's why it starts off as a medical determination. And of course, understanding the medical situation and the circumstances of the person, then the court is in a position to decide what other factors to take into account and to award a just compensation. So I'll start off with the medical aspects. Now, I also think it's important for medical practitioners, when they are asked to assist the court in that respect, to understand what general damages are, what the purpose is of general damages compensation. And again, just from my point of view, how I've been informed is that compensation for general damages is for loss or damage that you can't measure in money. Yes. In other words, it's not for costs or loss of earnings or anything. It is for essentially those abstract elements which are significant and important, but you can't weigh them in money. And the words that I've been taught is they are for pain and suffering, loss of amenities, and loss of enjoyment of life. So when the medical practitioner is considering what is relevant for the court to make a decision about general damages, the person must take into account how does the damage to this person affect their pain, their suffering, loss of amenities, and loss of enjoyment of life. So each of those aspects should be investigated at a minimum by the medical practitioner.
Yes, as broad categories of what we would call non-pecuniary or non-patrimonial loss for the lawyers, but certainly under the heading of general damages, and then just to draw the distinction, of course, between general damages and special damages, which we don't need to go into, but just to keep things compartmentalized in our minds. But that I'm in perfect agreement with that, Herman.
All right. Now, the next issue is something which I think some medical experts get and others don't get, and maybe they just haven't thought about this. But there are two equally important but totally different medical diagnoses that have to be made in order to assist the court. And for convenience, these can be referred to as the injury diagnosis and the outcome diagnosis. Now, to give you an example of what that means, if a person breaks the femur in their leg, the injury diagnosis is a fractured femur.
Yes.
But now everybody with a fractured femur doesn't end up in the same condition after improvement or recovery or rehabilitation has set in. So a fractured femur can end up with a very good recovery, so the person has no pain, no functional impairment. If you take an X-ray, you can see where the fracture was, but there's functionally a complete recovery. So in that case, the injury diagnosis would be fractured femur, and the outcome diagnosis would be full recovery.
Yes.
However, the fracture may not recover. The fracture may unite, but in a malaligned position, and there can be shortening of the leg or angulation of the leg. And in that case, the injury diagnosis is fractured femur, and the outcome diagnosis is shortened leg due to malunited fracture of the femur. The fracture can also become complicated by sepsis, and that can then give rise to a chronic discharging sinus at the site of the fracture. The fracture could also have been complicated by fat embolism, which could have harmed the brain and or the heart and the lungs,
Yes.
and then that could also be an element of the outcome diagnosis.
Herman, can I just on that, can you please just briefly tell us, well, we see this in the law reports from time to time, what is meant by fat embolism?
Yes. It's related to the long bones. We're not talking about small bones, but long
Yes.
bones. The bone shaft on the outside is hard cortical bone. And then inside that, there's cancellous bone, which is more, I don't know how to describe what cancellous bone looks like, but it's like brittle bone with spaces in between. And then inside there's a hollow shaft, and that is filled with bone marrow. Now the bone marrow is fat. Now, if you break a long bone, that fat of the bone marrow can get into the blood supply. So fat gets into the venous drainage from the bone. And those fat globules then go in the venous system to the heart and then to the lungs. And so when they end up in the lungs, then they get stuck in capillary vessels in the lungs. And that blocks blood flow through the lungs, and it interferes with proper oxygenation of the blood. So embolism means that it has moved through the circulation from one point, which is the site of fracture, to another point, which in this example is the lungs. So that is what an embolism is, something that moves in the circulation to another place. And in this case, it's fat.
So then, Herman, to take you back to your example, I just thought it might be, since you'd mentioned that, quite useful to explore that, because now you can then tie that into the two types of diagnoses. That's the injury diagnosis and the outcome diagnosis.
Yes. Okay, so the injury diagnosis is the diagnosis that is most commonly thought of by medical practitioners. As I said, a fractured femur, or a lacerated thigh, or a dislocated elbow, or a penetrating chest injury with collapse of the lung, or a blunt abdominal injury with rupture of the liver. All of those are injury diagnoses. All of those are diagnoses that can be made on day one. So when the person goes to hospital, normally the injury diagnosis is made. Sometimes not with enough specificity, and sometimes certain elements of injury diagnosis are missed. But generally speaking, you can determine the injury diagnosis from the contemporaneous medical records. That is the general expectation. Okay. Right. The outcome diagnosis means after the condition has stabilized, what is the permanent impairment that has resulted from those injuries. Now, the use of the AMA guides, which has been legislated in South Africa, has a convenient term for that. They call this the status maximal medical improvement, MMI. So the outcome diagnosis, using that American terminology, is the permanent impairment diagnosis after MMI, or maximal medical improvement. And what maximal medical improvement means is that the doctor making the assessment does not foresee any significant change to the status in the next 12 months, which means it's just a more explicit way of saying the condition has stabilized.
Yes.
Now, depending on the type of injury, the time from the injury until MMI can vary a lot. So often in orthopedic injuries, you achieve MMI by 6 months, sometimes even earlier than 6 months. With traumatic brain injuries, the general expectation is 2 years after the injury. If there are serious complications like chronic infection, which are amenable to treatment, so if there's a chronic infection at 2 years, but which can be treated surgically and may recover, then you would not certify MMI until that treatment has been done and has been found to be successful or unsuccessful.
Right.
Time until MMI is fairly variable. MMI is an event in time, maximum medical improvement. So you start off with the injury diagnosis. Okay, so ruptured liver and fractured femur and fractured skull, for example. Those are the injury diagnoses. When all of those have stabilized to a point where one does not anticipate any significant change in the next 12 months, then you certify MMI.
Right.
When MMI has been achieved, then the doctor should formulate an outcome diagnosis.
I see.
So the outcome diagnosis is, in fact, let's call it a label that is applied to the permanent sequelae of the injury after MMI. So another way of looking at this concept of outcome diagnosis is to say the permanent impairment.
Yes.
So, for example, if there was a splenic rupture and then they had to operate and remove the spleen, then the injury diagnosis will be blunt abdominal trauma with ruptured spleen. The outcome diagnosis will be asplenism due to surgical removal of the spleen. That has its own long-term implications.
So, Herman, in other words, when you take your injury diagnosis and your outcome diagnosis and you combine them,
yes,
you're getting what, in layman's terms, I'm going to say, but it'll be important from the judicial perspective, is to try to get a complete picture of the effect of that incident, let's say a road accident, on the life of the plaintiff.
Absolutely. And that is why I emphasize, Ian, that it is important for the medical practitioner to formulate both diagnoses, because they are different things and they are important for different reasons. So let me just state simply why each of them is important.
Yes.
Obviously, everybody will understand if you were injured in a car accident or somebody threw you down the steps, what injuries you suffered are important to know, because that is the initial harm that was caused by the event in question. Now, the harm is measured in terms of the initial symptoms, the amount of treatment, the costs of treatment, the time off work, while the person is recovering from the injuries or being treated for the injuries. Eventually, one gets to the point of maximal medical improvement. And it is after that that the medico-legal system tries to estimate the amount of damages. So the estimation of all damages occurs after the condition has stabilized. Now, it is simple enough in concept to look backwards into history to see what were the past medical expenses, what was the loss of earnings, what was the time off work, what was the documented pain and suffering to date. So that is a relatively easy exercise to quantify and describe the damages from the time of the accident until now, which is the time of assessment. But now, because you've got one day in court, you're not going to come back to court every 2 years to say how much you're suffering. So
Yes.
now the system, and in the ultimate analysis, the court must estimate what will be this person's losses or damages over the rest of their life.
Yes.
And that projection is made based on the outcome diagnosis, because it relates to the present and the future. And that does not relate to the injury diagnosis. And even though it was caused by the injuries, there is so much variability for a particular injury in what the different outcomes can be. It is not logical to try and predict the future from a variable thing in the past.
Yes, and the other aspect, Herman, that ties into that is that the same injury does not have the same necessarily, in fact, probably very seldom will have the same impact on different people and different people's lives. There's so many variables within individuals that you have to look at what the consequences, in other words, the outcome of that injury is on that particular individual in order to get to a proper assessment of the general damages due to that person.
Yes, and Ian, that's a very important point you raise. And I must say that the RAF Amendment Act is very good in recognizing that point, because the Act says that the circumstances of the third party must be taken into account.
Correct.
It's not just what doesn't work, it is what does that person do in their life? What do they need in their life? And the same outcome diagnosis can have very different effects in terms of loss of amenities and loss of enjoyment of life, depending on people in different circumstances. So, for example, an advocate with a fused ankle who drives his automatic car to work every day can have very little impairment of his life from that fused ankle. Whereas somebody who has to walk over the hill to fetch water every day has a major impairment in his life from exactly the same outcome diagnosis.
Yes, exactly.
So that has to be taken into account.